Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, a contractor supporting Western Area Power Administration and the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. I'm filling in for Randy Mannion as today's webinar chair. Today's webinar, titled Facility and Community Scale Project Development, is the 9th webinar of the 2018 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website, along with copies of today's PowerPoint presentations in about 1 week. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of all of the presentations. However, you can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and deployment supervisor in the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. Lizana is responsible, let me share my screen. I'm not sharing it. Lizana is responsible for managing technical assistance in education and outreach activities on behalf of the office, implementing national funding opportunities and administering the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for nearly 20 years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to the 9th webinar of the 2018 series. This webinar series is sponsored by 2 U.S. Department of Energy organizations, the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy for short, and the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA. The Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy and infrastructure, energy costs, and electrification of Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program works within the Department of Energy, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a 3-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. This tribal webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. This webinar series is part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy business and economic development decision-making, and information sharing among tribes is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, as well as to highlight tribal energy case studies and identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and to develop sustainable local economies. In today's webinar, we will focus on small and medium scale energy development, or what we call facility and community scale projects. Projects of this size are a great way for tribes to gain experience and expertise in energy project development while limiting the risks. However, at this scale, there are also unique challenges, such as how to finance such a project and what is the right project for you. Today's presenters will provide you with insight into some of the unique challenges and solutions for energy development at these smaller scales. We hope the webinar and the webinar series is useful to you, but we also welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways that we can make the series better. And with that, I will turn the virtual floor back over to James.
Thank you, Lizana. On today's agenda, we have 2 presentations and a demonstration of the Tribal Energy Atlas. I will introduce all of the speakers now. Our first speaker is Anthony Giacobbe. Mr. Giacobbe has over 15 years of experience in corporate strategic planning, account management, sales and marketing, policymaking, and employee training for both national and international companies. Mr. Giacobbe has served as the Director of Power and Gas at the Seneca Nation for the past 5 years. He has experience with distributed generation projects, natural gas and electricity supply, natural gas distribution expansion, interstate supply interconnection, rate analysis, and energy efficiency initiatives. Anthony received his bachelor's degree from Clarkson University and has a graduate degree from Canisius College. Following Anthony, we will hear from Lucas Capel. Mr. Capel contributes to project development and management efforts within the Renewable Energy Group at Bonneville Environmental Foundation, which advances renewables in the Northwest through innovative and creative solutions. Prior to contributing towards the effort of BEF, or Bonneville Environmental Foundation, Lucas worked within public and utility-based commercial, industrial, and residential energy efficiency programs. With these programs, he completed building energy analyses and guided contractors through energy retrofits. Lucas has also worked in solar outreach and has assisted on field-scale research on the use of short rotation woody crops for phytoremediation and bioenergy. Lucas holds a Bachelor of Science degrees from Illinois State University in renewable energy with a focus on environmental studies and economics. Our final speaker will be Anelia Milbrandt. Ms. Milbrandt is an energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, specializing in bioenergy research with extensive experience in the areas of biomass resource assessment, geospatial analysis, and project management. Most of her work during the past 14 years has been centered on evaluating the existing or potentially available biomass resources in the United States and abroad. These resources include solid biomass waste materials such as crop residues, forest residues, and municipal solid waste, as well as liquid sources such as fats, oils, and greases. She is a lead researcher and author of publications related to biogas resource and market assessments. Other areas of expertise include biogeography and geospatial analysis applied in biomass resource assessments, feasibility studies, and infrastructure, market, and policy analyses. Anelia has extensive experience in managing projects and programs related to bioenergy development in the United States and abroad. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Geography from University of Sofia in Bulgaria. So with that, we'll get started on our first presentation. We'll pause a moment for me to bring it up. All right, Mr. Giacobbe, I have your slides up. You may proceed.
All right, thank you, James. My name is Anthony Giacobbe. I'm the Director of Power and Gas at Seneca Energy with the Seneca Nation. I'm also a member of the DOE ICWIG group, which is the Indian Country Energy Infrastructure Working Group, where we craft tools and help craft tools and resources that can assist with moving energy projects forward in Indian country. So today I have a relatively broad presentation touching on strategic planning, business structures, and financing in the context of our two renewable projects that we've installed over the last couple of years. The Seneca Nation has taken a progressive approach to exploring, planning, and implementing an impactful, sustainable energy platform that will help to diversify energy supply and provide better services to the Seneca people. Next slide, James. The Seneca Nation is made up of two primary territories, the Cattaraugus and Allegheny. They're separated by about 45 minutes. We'll talk about some of the challenges that can cause. Our executives actually flip every 2 years from one territory to the other, and we have 16 counselors, 8 from each territory, that make up our executive leadership team. Next slide. The mission of Seneca Energy is to ensure the security, prosperity, and independence of the Seneca Nation by building a sustainable energy platform and lowering energy costs for the nation and its residents. One of the ways we're accomplishing this is by installing distributed generation assets such as our 1.5 megawatt wind turbine and our 2 megawatt solar array. These projects are harnessing the nation's abundant natural resources and offsetting high energy costs while benefiting the environment by providing significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So how did we get there? Some of this seems obvious, but I think it is very important. Leadership, that's first on the executive team that I mentioned, and also within the organization. Capital investment and really your appetite for risk. When you're starting out, the nation is going to have to put up money in order to get these projects off the ground. Team development is extremely important. I'm lucky to have a great team to work with over here at the Seneca Nation, and they are really an extension of myself. So it's really cultivating that strong teamwork and really utilizing all the resources that we have. Perseverance, determination, again, sounds somewhat obvious, but I'll give you some examples where some of our projects, the landmines that we hit and where we really could have strayed off course, but we're able to get our projects done. And then strategic vision, which we'll talk about here in the next few slides. So I won't go through all of these, but a few, and give you some examples of what we did and how we were successful. Identify stakeholders is extremely important. We created something called Energy Steering Committee. It was basically the head of multiple different departments where energy was touching that department in one way or another, which is most. And we looked at where we are, where we wanted to be, and how we were going to get there. And that was some of the early stages where the nation really came together to figure out the direction that we wanted to go. Forming a leadership team. I mentioned the executives. We also have a Seneca Utilities Commission, which is the board of directors that I report to. So I think that's important that you have a board that you can report to, and that commission has been that for us. We developed an energy vision, which we'll talk about more, and assessing needs, resources, developing specific long and short-term goals, and then prioritizing projects. An example there, we actually came up with something called the decision matrix, where we have criteria and we'll actually score points to the different projects, and then based off, there'll be a threshold, and if it essentially scores high enough, the project would move forward. If it does not, then the project would be tabled at that time. Identify financing options. Are you going to self-finance? Are you going to go after grants or some of the loans that are out there? The strategic plans, an actual document, physical document that you can point to that'll help you in challenging times when you need to really keep the course and make sure that you're moving in the direction that you're planning to. And then finally, measurement and verification and plan alterations. I think it's important to be flexible. Although you do have that physical document and the strategic energy plan, you can't predict everything that's going to take place. So I think it's important to have flexibility built in within your organization. Next slide. So strategic planning, really a long-term strategy. It provides valuable guidance for addressing energy challenges in times when tough decisions need to be made. It really can extend beyond changing political administrations and helps address barriers by providing a long-term view that prioritizes projects over the next several years. And it's a real good opportunity to engage with all of your stakeholders. Next slide. These are a number of grants that we have gone through starting back in the early 2000s. So I think that's where it comes back to the perseverance and determination. This is what I'm talking about. You can see we did some of our first step grants. Those are early 2000s. As I mentioned, we went through, did our loan anemometer loan program for our wind studies, some other first step grants through DOE, DOI, and Seneca Energy was not established until 2011. So it took us quite a number of years to get there, and we actually didn't staff Seneca Energy until 2014. So it definitely certainly took perseverance and determination to get us there. The final grant is the Tribal Energy Program Clean Energy Deployment Grant we received in 2015, and that was a $1.5 million DOE grant that we received that we utilized for our wind turbine project. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk specifically about that project. So our energy vision, I'm not going to read all of these, but these are basically the pillars that we point to. This is a lot of the criteria that goes into the decision matrix that I mentioned, and I'm really proud to say we're really hitting all of these to some degree today, which wasn't the case, a couple of years ago. So this is what we really point to make sure that we are staying the course and moving towards the goals that we've set. So a little bit on business structures. I'm going to talk really primarily about two. You can create your utility, your tribal utility, under a few different processes. You could go under a Section 17 company, corporation. That's under the Indian Reorganization Act. You could go for a corporation chartered under tribally enacted laws or state laws. What we did, Seneca Energy, is an LLC that was organized under tribal law. So that was the route that we took. And I know there's a number of Section 17 companies out there as well. Next slide. If you don't know much about a Section 17 corporation, essentially the BIA approves and issues corporate charters. You submit a resolution petitioning for issuance of a charter. It'll describe the details regarding the business purpose, how it will be managed, the powers and limitations, and then ultimately get a certificate of approval. BIA will ensure that the charter was adopted in accordance with tribal law and that the charter contains no provisions contrary to federal law. Next slide. Some advantages: wholly owned by the nation or the tribe, and it's separate and distinct. So if the corporation defaults on a payment of funds that is borrowed, only the corporation's property and assets are at risk. So it's really at arm's length, that the nation or the tribe would not be at risk in those situations. And also no federal income taxes, whether operating on or off territory. Some disadvantages: it's relatively inflexible. It literally takes an act of Congress to dissolve the corporation. And minimal statutory definition. It's a lot of words there, but basically saying that corporations that are started under state law, they're really governed, all the aspects of the formation, management, operations, that's all tightly managed. So it gives confidence to lenders and other business partners who otherwise may be hesitant to enter into contracts if they're not real familiar. You may not be under Section 17. You're not going to be held to some of the reporting, financial reporting. So that can make it a little bit more difficult to partner with outside entities. Next slide. Tribally chartered corporations. So this is what Seneca Energy LLC is. Our charter specifies the management structure. We're run by the board of directors that I mentioned, and the nation is our sole shareholder. So essentially the board then selects an executive to oversee the corporation's day-to-day operations. Next slide. Some advantages: will not be subject to state control or taxation, which is a big deal for us. Easy to form. It's formed by tribal government. No approval is obtained from federal or state authorities. If the tribally chartered corporation conducts business outside the territory, it should be aware that some states may require it to register with them as a foreign corporation, as they do for all other out-of-state corporations. Next slide. Some disadvantages similar to what we talked about under the Section 17 corporation: transparency, and can cause some hesitancy for lenders and partners. You may have trouble accessing capital, attracting joint venture partners due to that lack of financial reporting and transparency. The potential federal tax liability, that's a question. Essentially, the IRS will exempt tribally chartered corporations that operate as an integral part of the nation or the tribe. So factors may include the extent to which the tribe controls, funds, shares in the profits of the corporation, how it selects its board of directors, and if it does require the corporation to provide regular financial reporting. So that you may have the question under a tribally chartered corporation, is it an integral part of the nation? Next slide. So once you decide on the business structure and you get into projects, everybody's probably seen most of this, but we really start as feasibility and public outreach on the front end. You have to identify your champions. So out of those executives, if a few counselors can really be your champions or executives, that's going to really help you move your organization forward. You have to identify technologies and the resources that are available to you. Like I mentioned, we did that through some grants where we did the anemometer loan program. We were able to get some funds to put up essentially wind towers and test the wind where we ultimately put our location for our wind turbine. Coordinate the team, different agencies. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we manage multiple grants with our projects and multiple departments, so that's extremely important. Site selection, you need to determine, is it nation controlled or is there a land purchase required? And then financing. Next slide. Contracting, you're thinking about things like sovereign immunity, can you use nation law, dispute resolution, are you going to have a court referenced in the contract or go through mediation, arbitration? Probably the biggest contract that you'll enter into is something called an EPC, engineering, procurement, construction contract. And those can be pretty turnkey where they'll cover the majority of the aspects of the project. You can put a lot of the utility interconnection even into that agreement. So that's certainly the most important agreement I believe that you'd enter into, probably aside from the utility interconnect. Permitting and approvals. A NEPA study may be required. For us, an example, we are a pre-BIA, basically a treaty tribe, so we would not have to do a NEPA study generally. But if we take federal funds, we do. So an example of when we did receive that DOE grant, we went through a full NEPA study. It took us probably 8 to 9 months to get through that study. So that's going to slow you down a little bit. So you do want to look at what type of permitting is required, who's the lead agency, because that is going to be time and money. Construction, who's overseeing the construction, contract fulfillment. You really need a good project manager. Interconnection, who's responsible for filing the paperwork. We did have to waive sovereign immunity. We did limited waivers with our utilities. When we did both of our projects, we were able in our EPC contract to utilize nation law, which was not waive sovereign immunity, but with the utility, based off some past experiences, we had to do a limited waiver in order to get that done. So, that's another thing to think about, is leadership willing to do that limited waiver in order to get the project done. You also do something called the CESIR, Coordinated Electric System Interconnection Review, and that'll determine the cost of interconnection. For our wind turbine project, we had a cost of $1 million to interconnect that project. We actually negotiated it down $250,000, and we were able to do it for $750,000. But it is not cheap, and it was a little bit more outside of our original budgeting plans. And again, we had to negotiate that down with the utility. We did the same thing in our solar project, where we were able to reduce that cost by $250,000. So between the two projects, pushing back on the utility, using some technical details on why we felt between us and our EPC that some of what they were requiring was not really necessary, we were able to save $500,000. So I think it's important to know that you can fight back on those original numbers that you receive. And then finally, post-construction administration. We have O&M agreements for both projects. We have an availability guarantee for our wind turbine and a production guarantee for our solar. And I think it's just very important to think about that. We have monitoring systems for both as well. So that's something we're going in daily, running reports, and keeping an eye, making sure that we're generating what we expected and bringing in the revenue needed. Next slide. Here's some pictures of our wind turbine. We're putting it up in a bit of a snowstorm, I should say. And you can see our foundation. Our foundation is about 20 feet down. We had to dig down. It was a little bit wet in that area. We used about 400 yards of concrete. So we poured concrete pillars. And then you can see the tower. The tower is about 411 feet to the tip of the blades, and 85-meter hub height. 82 meters is the rotor diameter. And it's a gearless rotor, so less moving parts, and the hope is less maintenance. It's a Ventus machine, which is out of Germany. Our next slide shows the rotor fly. So just probably the best part of the whole project is when you're putting up the rotor and you put the blades on the ground, lift it up with 2 cranes, and you attach it to the head. It's called the nacelle of the turbine. So you can see that there. Next slide. So our capital investment that I talked about for this project, the nation invested $3.5 million. We received $2.5 million in grants. Talked about the DOE grant, the $1.5 million. That program is run by Lizana, so she was a great help. And that's a grant that comes out every year generally, and I think it's a great opportunity to look at it if you haven't for some of these different renewable or fossil fuel projects that you're working on. It was commissioned in March of 2017. The power is virtually net metered, which we'll talk about in a few slides. We've generated over 4 million kilowatt hours to date and 500,000 in revenue. Some of the community benefits and one of the reasons we received the grant, on our 2 territories, people receive different electricity rates. We have a public utility on our Allegheny territory, so people are paying less per kilowatt hour than they are in Cattaraugus and some of our other areas. So what we do for those higher rate areas is everybody who's in good standing with the utility receives $25 a month credit right off their bill. So we essentially are sending the utility a check for a certain amount, and they are an ACH payment, and they are applying an ACH payment of $25 a month to all the list of, now we have over 500 people that are signed up for our credit programs. The project payback is going to be about 8 years. So far, I guess I should say we paid over about $130,000 to our Cattaraugus members from this project. We talked about in one of our pillars, employment was extremely important. With this project, we're really proud that the Seneca people really put the wind turbine up. We utilized some local unions, but it was all Seneca members. We had iron workers, operators, and we have some full-time employees. So it was really the Seneca Nation that erected that wind turbine. With the generation emission statistics, I think the main thing I want to point out, again, one of our goals is really helping Mother Earth, benefiting the environment. We're reducing nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, mercury vapor by millions of pounds on an annual basis. So we're really proud of that. Next slide. Federal grants, obviously they bring down the overall cost of the project. They're not a long-term source of funding. So you do have to figure out, what are you going to do beyond grants? I think it's important to note a lot of grants are just feasibility. So it's nice to not have to pay for the feasibility to see if a project is worth pursuing, but you can't use those funds towards an actual project. And I think that's the biggest benefit that I see with the DOE deployment and implementation grant is you can take those funds and actually put it towards the project. So it's bringing down your overall cost. And I mentioned timeframe, oversight expectations. I think you do have to know it's going to take time to write the grant. It's going to take time to receive those funds, and then you may have some more permitting requirements as well. Next slide. Net metering and virtual net metering. Net metering is a billing mechanism that credits energy system owners for electricity added to the grid. So customers are only billed for their net energy usage. So the example is a rooftop PV system may generate more electricity than used during daylight hours. If net metered, the electricity meter will run backwards to provide a credit against what electricity is consumed at night or other periods where the electricity use exceeds the system's output. The main thing with net metering, the difference between net metering and virtual net metering, with net metering, the load has to be located at the same place as the generation system, or is located at the same place. With virtual net metering, you can have your generation system at a location that may not be where the load is. And this does vary state to state, so you want to look if you have virtual net metering or net metering available and what sizes you can go to. An example of that is, so our solar project is on our Allegheny territory. We're net metering an account on our Cattaraugus territory that's the 45 minutes away. But as long as it's within the same utility, we're able to do that. Next slide. This is our solar array, over 5,700 panels, 44.5 miles of wire. It's about an 8-acre site. The panels are 340 watts. And next slide, we show our inverters. We have 49 string inverters. Big thing with string inverters, that's kind of the way the industry is going now. It used to be central inverters, but if you had 2 or 3 central inverters, when one of those goes down, you're losing either half of your array or a third of your array, where with the string inverters, when one of these inverters goes down, we're only losing a small portion of the overall array before we can get that inverter back up and running. Next slide. Our investment here was $3.4 million, commissioned the end of 2017. Talked about the virtual net metering and the acreage. We did self-fund this project. We basically self-financed. We did receive $750,000 from NYSERDA, which is a New York agency. It's basically if you pay into the utility, there's a renewable portfolio charge that the utility will charge you. It goes into a fund, and you're able to utilize that for projects like this. We paid another $15,000 to residents off the solar project so far, and we hired a local Seneca company who installed the racking, and we had some Seneca members that worked with the electrical contractor as well. And we are looking at the USDA RUS loan, which I'll talk about in a slide or two, to refinance this project. Next slide. So you've probably heard of this now. It's been talked about a lot recently, but the DOE Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, something we did help out with some feedback through the ICWIG group. Guarantees up to $2 billion in loans to support energy economic opportunities. Guarantees 90% of the unpaid principal and interest. And the borrower is required to invest equity, and all debt will be provided by non-federal lenders. Essentially, the nation or the tribe will apply to an eligible lender, which will in turn apply to the DOE for the partial guarantee. Lenders are traditional retail banks, and the guarantee helps lenders feel more comfortable providing funds with things like sovereign immunity and some of the other challenges that we talked about where it may be difficult to find lenders who are willing to release funds. Next slide. This is the grant or the loan we're going for the solar project, USDA Rural Utility Services Loan. You do have to prove that it's a rural community. I mean, most of us are, I believe. It includes water, waste treatment, electric power, and telecommunication services. It's really helping to expand the economic opportunities in rural areas. It's a long, tedious process, I would say. We've been working on it for about 2 years, and it's finally to committee where USDA is deciding, if they're going to fund us or not. It's, from what we're hearing, 2 to 3% interest for 30 years. So it's pretty cheap money. If you can get that and utilize those funds for other projects and just pay the debt service over time. I think I have one more slide. These are just some highlights of some other projects that we're working on. We're installing solar at the agricultural and Cattaraugus Fish Hatchery now. We have some solar at some other locations. We'll have 4.6 megawatts of renewable power installed at the Seneca Nation once we get the agricultural department and our Cattaraugus Fish Hatchery online. So that's definitely a goal we've been striving for, and definitely proud of that. The residential solar loan program is something where we're trying to act sort of as some of those other loan programs, like the DOE loan program. The Seneca Nation is loaning money to residents and we're getting this through council. The plan is to loan to residents where they can put solar on their own rooftop or on the ground at their residence and help them strive for self-sufficiency as well. We've done a lot of LED lighting installations and other energy efficiency projects. We actually built a tiny home that's totally off-grid, run by solar with batteries. It's on a trailer, so it's mobile. And finally, our natural gas pipeline replacement and expansion. I didn't talk a ton about that today, but we've plugged and abandoned numerous wells to help the environment. We've had the utility fix lines throughout the territories, and we've fixed some lines as well. So that's been, again, towards that goal of really trying to preserve the environment and save the earth, the Mother Earth, for the next 7 generations. So that's been a strong focus for us. I believe that's all I have.
Thank you, Anthony. Excellent presentation, and we'll take questions at the end of all the presentations. Next, I'll bring up Lucas's slides. Hold on one moment. All right, I think we're set, Lucas. You can start.
Okay, great. Can you hear me all right?
Sound good.
Okay, perfect. Hi, so my name is Lucas Capel. I'm with the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, BEF for short, and hoping to provide a little bit of context and background on community solar and how it can benefit your tribal nation. Next slide. Perfect. Okay. So BEF, we started in the late 1990s as an effort of the Bonneville Power Administration, which is the federal power provider for the Pacific Northwest. So within their mission, we were started to complement their goals in renewable energy and watershed restoration. At this point, we are a separate entity, but we still do have some funding from BPA to continue to support those efforts. Some select historical events from our efforts. We pioneered the first renewable energy credit market, worked on one of the first community solar projects in the nation, facilitated development of one of the early wind farms in the Pacific Northwest, the White Creek Wind Farm, and then pioneered the first 10-year model watershed approach for watershed restoration. We currently have a staff of 20 plus and are leveraging funding from different agencies, companies, philanthropic partners, and of course the Bonneville Power Administration. We also sell carbon offsets and renewable energy credits. Next slide. So a little bit of my background, kind of as James mentioned before, I have 5+ years in renewable energy and energy efficiency, working with residential, commercial, tribal, low to moderate income, and government, completing audits, supporting programs, developing projects. I've been at BEF for a little under 2 years. Next slide. So just some context on renewable energy in the United States. The next couple of slides are just context preparing for what is community solar. So as of 2017, about 17% of the grid was renewables and 1% of that was solar. Next slide. As you're likely aware, renewable energy is quite popular within the United States. As of 2017, Pew Research, 65% of respondents had favorable opinions towards renewable energy, wind and solar. And then next slide. So why solar? Why is there a large popularity of solar? So part of that is due to falling costs. If you look at this graph, that leftern portion focused on the residential PV, also known as rooftop solar and utility solar. So you can see in 2009, about $7 per unit installed, and then all the way down to around $3 per unit installed in 2016. And you see similar trends in commercial and in utility scale as well. Next slide. So as far as technical potential, given that tribes, span the whole United States and projects could be in any state. So within solar, the whole United States has pretty good potential. Even looking in some of the lesser potential states, like I believe that North Dakota, you're still looking at 25% or less of that state's generation has the potential to be solar. So next slide. And then kind of to start, as we start diving into community solar, is rooftop solar. That's a type of solar installation that you've likely seen before or heard of before. Rooftop solar, usually talking about residential, as in this photo, but you could also be talking about commercial, small business, nonprofit. So this type of traditional solar installation is what people are familiar with and has really opened the market up for individuals to take hold of solar and see the benefits. But if we go to the next slide, there's definitely been some disadvantages of this type of rooftop solar. So within rooftop, not everyone owns a roof, or even if they do own the roof, they might not have a proper roof life. Usually you need 10 to 15 more years on your roof in order to implement on that facility. And it also needs to be able to hold the load of the solar. The costs of rooftop solar are usually relatively high in compared with commercial or utility, given that rooftop solar tends to be smaller scale installations when compared to commercial and utility. With rooftop, you have the tendency, you might be dealing with shading, whether that's from HVAC, whether that is from trees in the area, or you might just be facing the wrong direction. Ideally, you want south for solar, and if your building's not facing south, it can cause some complications. And then one of the final disadvantages I'm listing is just lack of electrical infrastructure. So if you're in a remote area where you might have an older grid system, it may not have the ability to take on additional load or additional generation from solar. Now, these are just some disadvantages. There are others I've listed, but kind of these disadvantages have been some of the reasons that people have not been able to access solar in the past. So if we move on to community solar, this slide kind of starts this concept of how do you get around some of those disadvantages. Community solar can mean a lot of different things, but I'll just start here. So in this photo, you see a off-site solar system, similar to what you saw in the previous presentation. And then within that solar system, energy from those panels go to the grid. And then each of these, in this case, homes down below, subscribe or own a portion of that system. So for example, we'd say that home on the south, let's say they own 33% of those panels. The home in the middle, maybe they're subscribing to 33% of the panels for 10 years, where they're paying a fee to be a part of the program and seeing the benefits. So this way, you're kind of allowing the solar system to be split up and sent to different partners. In this case, we're talking about houses, but it could also be, businesses, nonprofits, etc. So next slide. So kind of a little further discussing how it can be multiple entities. So in this area, in this photo, you're seeing, the corner store. Let's say they purchased 2 panels up front when the system was built. So they own those panels and they see the benefits of those panels on their bill. Jackson Family, we can say they're subscribing for 10 years. And then of course, Sunnyside Elementary, either owning, subscribing. But the concept here just being that community solar allows you to break down a solar system into smaller chunks and have your community participate. When those entities, corner store, the Jackson Family, might have had reasons they weren't able to participate in solar in the past. So if we go to the next slide, you can see multiple different types of community solar. So up in the top right, we are seeing this off-site shared solar, which is similar to what I just described previously. But understanding that there are lots of different models for community solar. Going up to the top left, community group purchasing, concept where, let's say in this case, you have 4 homes and they negotiate a contract with a solar installer to do bulk purchasing to get lower pricing. Bottom left, we have on-site shared solar, so a multi-unit building, whether that's businesses, whether that's residential renters. Let's say it's residential renters. Each one of those units may have a subscription to a chunk of that system and see the benefits from that system. And then down here to the bottom right, just kind of understanding the concept of community. So we have investors maybe taking advantage of federal tax credits to reduce the cost of the project. We have donations from potential organizers, maybe to facilitate a low to moderate income subscriptions for low to moderate income community members. And then just an understanding of that project, as the arrows go into the town, facilitating the expansion of solar in that town through partnerships with various entities and homeowners, or in this case, renters. So next slide. So the previous presentation touched on net metering a little bit, and so I'll gloss over this to a certain extent, but just the concept here being, we're looking at residential net metering in this case. Your energy, your photovoltaic solar system generates energy, goes to the home. The home uses any of the energy it can use, and then any excess energy the home doesn't use goes onto the grid. The home's also pulling from the grid. So then over the course of a period of time, let's say a month, you can subtract the amount of energy your home is using from the amount your solar system generated. Some months you're going to be producing more than you're using. Other months it'll be the opposite case. So we go to the next slide, delving into the concept of virtual net metering. Whereas in that previous concept, there was a direct physical connection on that home to the grid with the solar system. Virtual net metering, in this instance, let's say that house on the top is using about 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. They have a share that's of a solar system that's on a roof somewhere else other than their location, or maybe on a field somewhere other in another location. Their share is producing 800 kilowatt hours this month. They're getting an 800 kilowatt hour credit on their bill. So that on their bill, they're physically seeing 200 kilowatt hours. Next slide. So just some context on the growth of community solar. So as of 2010, there was a minimal amount of solar and community solar installations in the country. But as of 2017, we've seen drastic growth, and we're continuing to see that growth going on into 2018 and to the perceived future in 2020. Next slide. So just some more context on community solar growth. As of 2010, I'd mentioned that BEF partnered on some of the first community solar projects in the nation. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that we've partnered with over 28 utilities to deploy 2 megawatts of small-scale community solar. Within those utilities, we've worked with larger utilities such as Seattle City Light in Seattle. They have about 400,000 meters, all the way down to small municipalities with less than 1,000 meters. On to the next slide. While we haven't implemented a community solar within tribes at this point, we're definitely interested in facilitating that and making it happen. But we still have done some solar installations with tribes, a lot of school solar and a lot of facility on-site solar. Worked with Spokane out of Washington, Nez Perce out of Idaho, Tulalip in Washington, Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, Quinault, Skokomish, McCaw, Squamish, Ho, all out of Washington. And that's just a limited list. We've worked with several other tribes to facilitate these types of projects. And then, as mentioned before, with utility community solar with 28 utilities, including but not limited to Northern Lights in Idaho, Clark PUD in Washington, Flathead Electric in Montana. Next slide. So just a little concept of what community solar could look like. Similar to the other presentation with Flathead Electric in Montana, 100 kilowatts of solar, and I believe this was a purchase a panel model. So subscribers purchased a chunk of the solar system and then receive the credits of that generation of their purchased chunk on their utility bill. So if we go to the next slide. An example of our work at Tulalip Tribe. This is 16 kilowatts of pole-mounted solar on one of their academic facilities, and that just offsets the load of that facility. And the next slide. Another concept within community solar that we've really been pushing is the concept of low to moderate income participation in the program. So here, this is Emerald PUD. And it was one of the first low-income community solar within the nation, or within the Pacific Northwest. And within this project, a portion of the panels, of the generation from the panels was supplied to low-income subscribers. Within tribes, we've worked with Spokane Tribe and Grid Alternatives, who is a nonprofit solar installer, to facilitate development of solar on tribal elder housing. So we would definitely like to see continued efforts of low income, whether it's community solar or it's direct install within tribal communities as well. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see that we have enacted community solar policy in the dark solid blue color, and I believe it's about 13 states. And then the hash lines, that's active utility involved programs. You'll notice that there are quite a bit of states that don't have community solar programs or policies, but if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that just because they don't have policies doesn't mean that they haven't implemented community solar. So as of I believe 2018, 42 states have implemented at least one community solar project. There's about 19 states, not 13 like I mentioned before. There's about 19 states with programs. Over 1,000 megawatts installed of community solar as of 2018, and 3 gigawatts expected in the following years, powering nearly 500,000 homes. So if we go to the next slide. So what's the importance of tribal community solar projects? Why is this something that you should be interested in? Well, first off, there's multiple ways to participate if you're a tribe. You can develop and own a project and facilitate where those community benefits go to, whether it's community members, whether it's to locations within your tribal nation. You could lease land for third-party development of community solar projects, or you could facilitate subscriptions to members, whether that's low income or just your general population. And those are just some potential tribal projects. As you probably noticed before, community solar has the ability to be morphed, and there's a lot of room for creativity in order to facilitate development with projects in locations that you may not have been able to in the past due to the limitations discussed earlier. So you can really benefit from the large scale of maybe an off-site system without the complexity of dealing with rooftop implementation. So if we go to the next slide. So kind of how to get started in figuring out community solar within your nation. Definitely reach out to US DOE's Office of Indian Energy. Contact the Coalition for Community Solar Access. They have a good background and party and knowledge of states with of community solar implementers within your state. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier Grid Alternatives. They're a nonprofit solar installer within the United States, and they have a pretty robust tribal program. So I would advise looking into them as well. And then if you go on to the next slide, in the Pacific Northwest, the Bonneville Environmental Foundation can help with community solar or other renewable energy development. We provide project development and technical assistance, grant sourcing and applications, project management, development within solar, whether that's community solar, small scale, large scale, or just on-site, biomass, hydrogen, hydro, and more. And we facilitate development within consumer-owned utility areas. And I think the next slide is my last slide. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about community solar. Looking forward to questions. And please reach out if you have any questions about facilitating solar within your area. And also whether I can facilitate, relationships in your state, or figure out how we can make a project happen in your nation if you're within the Pacific Northwest. I look forward to questions and outreach from organizations. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Lucas. Excellent presentation. Next, we'll hear from Anelia. She does not have a presentation. She is, presenting an online tool. So just stand by while I transfer control over to Anelia. All right, Anelia, Jim, I think you're the light.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
You sound good.
Perfect. And you see my screen? Excellent. Thank you. Welcome everybody again, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I have the pleasure to demoing the Tribal Energy Atlas, which is an interactive geospatial application that allows users to view resources, infrastructure, market, and other pertinent information. Users also can query the data, perform some analysis, which I will show you today, download some databases and use it for your own purposes in your own applications, print maps for presentations, and some other features. As you can see, this is the initial screen of the tool. It illustrates locations in Alaska, and the contiguous 48 states. On the upper right-hand side, I just want to point out we have some standard application features such as zooming in and out. You can change the base map if you prefer to use the typical Google road map, or if you would like to use terrain or satellite imagery, you're welcome to do so. For our purposes today, I won't focus on that. You can click on the About function, where you can read more about the tool, get a little bit more background information, who to reach out and how it was developed and so forth. If you had zoomed in or not, you can go back to the home screen, which is the current extent. Again, you can print here. This will take a little while. I won't run it right now, but if you'd like to print out a map of your analysis for a presentation, again, it will certainly generate, it will take a little time. Oh, great. It did actually work while I was speaking. Excellent. You can also do a tutorial, which is similar to what I'll be doing now. It just, this particular function will walk through the GIS functionality of the application. But as I said, it's pretty intuitive. It's very easy to use. No prior GIS sort of experience is required. The initial screen begins with information on the wind capacity factor, which you need for estimating distributed generation potential. I'm going to turn this off just to walk you through some of the other layers available here. We provide, as you can see, the main tab here is resources. We have information for wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, woody biomass, and biomethane. I will walk you through very briefly to get a sense for what we have. But again, we encourage you to use the tool in your own time and get back to us with questions, feedback, and suggestions. We do provide information on the utility scale wind generation potential within tribes. As you see, it's predominantly, I'm actually going to zoom in just so we can see it easily here. For illustrative purposes. This particular function allows you to download the data. Currently, it's not available for resources. We're still working on the data to package it and provide it to the public, but it will be available soon. It is available for all the other layers, and I will show that in a moment. The question mark, if you click on that particular feature, this box sort of talks about more about the layer, what it represents, where you can go get more information about it, learn more about the methodology, what is the time reference, and so forth. You can also click on the legend button, and that shows practically what the different colors represent, what are the units of measure, and so forth. And you can query the data by selecting either region. You can do custom shape or point query. I will just click here for just for illustrative purposes. So we have this particular location. We have wind generation potential as well as the area in square kilometers. Going back to the layers, we also provide for purely illustrative purposes the wind, solar, geothermal, and for all the other resources, a generation potential within 10-mile radius. This is purely for illustrative purposes to show how much more resources we can gather with adjacent lands of the tribal areas. And as I mentioned, the wind capacity factor was displayed earlier. Similarly, for solar, we have the utility scale PV potential. Again, you can click on the legend and you can see units and what the different colors represent. Typically, the darker the color, the higher the potential. The same for concentrating solar power. And again, for capacity factor, it's also displayed. Moving on quickly, we have information on geothermal. I won't click through those just for the sake of time. Woody biomass. And I would like to spend a little time here on the biomethane. This is another word for biogas. I'm sure you've all had heard that term. Biogas, it's when it's purified, it just generates predominantly methane. It's cleaned up to sort of simulate natural gas, and it's pure natural gas at that point, and it is used to generate electricity or renewable natural gas, which could be used as a fuel in vehicles. We provide estimates within tribes and within 10 miles of tribes for biomethane from manure, which is from confined animal feeding operations. Again, within tribes, we provide similar information for biomethane from landfills. These are also clipped to the tribal areas. We also provide that information for wastewater treatment plants. As you can see, it's very dense, so you can use some of those tools up there. And as you zoom in, you see the tool reset, so you can actually have a clear picture and overlay additional information, as I'm going to show you very shortly. So going back to the previous extent, just so we can see more of the area. Now, we also provide information on casinos with restaurants. Unfortunately, we were not able to gather information on the amount of food waste that is collected and generated at each of the casinos, which is the information we need in order to estimate the biomethane. But we show this information in terms of the number of restaurants as a proxy for folks to understand what the potential could be in a given area. Again, you can click on the legend and see what the different bubble sizes illustrate. But again, the hope is, again, to generate attention to that particular resource that is largely untapped in the U.S. Moving on to, I will collapse the resources just to move on to the next tab. In infrastructure location, we have data on transmission lines. So let me see here. Where is it not? In railroads. I don't know why it's not displaying the transmission lines. That's interesting. I hope people are not trying to log in all at once in the tool, which is typically why we see that happening. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of people are trying to log into the tool at the moment as I'm speaking. Unfortunately, I should have mentioned. If 50 people log in at the same time, we start. Oh, perfect. Thank you, if some of you logged off. So this again provides information on the transmission lines. You can use the legend to see what the kilowatts, the different colors represent in terms of kilovolts. You can also query the data if you'd like to see who the owner of these locations are. So you can see for this particular location, I clicked on a specific corp, but it also pulls information for some additional ones. You will have to really zoom in order to see more detail. We provide information on railroads. I will show in an example later how it's relevant for some of the renewable energy resources. We also provide information on some conventional resources, such as natural gas. Naturally provide some market information, such as the import and export hubs, pipelines, market hubs, processing plants, storage facilities, and so forth, to enable your own analysis on sites. Similarly, we provide the same infrastructure information for petroleum refineries, pipelines, terminals, and so forth. Again, you can zoom in to a location you would like to investigate. Simply click on and off on different sort of data. I failed earlier to mention that right now we do actually have, for all the infrastructure and environmental and the rest of the information, we allow all the data to be downloaded in several type of formats. The CSV file could be used in Excel spreadsheets, shapefiles, KML, and JSON. These are all geospatial files that you can use if you have geospatial applications to run it. But these are all available to you to download and, again, run your own analysis if need be. We also provide information on power plants, all conventional and renewable, such as geothermal, solar, wind. So you can see where all these facilities are actually located and how they relate to your particular location. Biopower plants are also available. These are coal-firing power plants that they burn in addition to coal biomass, landfills, and municipal solid waste, and so forth. Pellet plants, which are gaining a lot of interest recently, and dedicated wood and wood waste plants. again, I'm going to collapse that and move on to environmental data that we have. We're providing information on water availability, namely fresh groundwater resources, surface water. One thing I would like to mention that you can do with the tool, as you see now, the tribal lands are sort of in the background. You can go to the legend and change the order. And as you see, the tribal lands are displayed on top. That allows for just a better visualization of the data. So please keep that in mind. You can also adjust the transparency. If you have multiple layers, you would like to adjust and make it stronger color, or again, play with the transparency and still see the data. But as you start adding additional layers, it could get very busy. So again, playing with the order and transparency really works really well for various data sets. We also provide information on greenhouse gas emission from stationary sources. Think of cement plants, power plants, ammonia, ethanol refineries, and so forth. It's very busy, but again, you can zoom in, and then, as I mentioned and showed you earlier, the tool resets and show. This is just because it's overwhelming at the national scale. Same information we provide for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. We also provide information on protected areas and critical habitat. These are pertinent, very critical type of data you need for any type of project before you begin. So we provide that information as well. Under climate, we provide information on cooling and heating degree days. They measure the amount of energy that is needed to cool or heat the building to normal, comfortable temperature. So that information is also provided. Again, you can download the data if you need any of those information for purposes. We provide also information on energy expenditures, which is the average household electricity bill in dollars per month for low to moderate income households at the county level. And we provide also that information for all households at the same time in terms of residential at the county level. Another type of information that the tool has at the moment is energy efficiency, namely the primary energy savings for all upgrades when the net present value is positive. This data is available by state. Again, you can go for more information to a report that we provide here that was just published this last year. The same information is provided in terms of percentage, and we also provide information on the savings from upgraded heat pumps when the net present value is positive, and also the same type of information when you have the standard payback period of less than 5 years. Moving on, we also provide some market data on electricity and natural gas prices. This data is pretty current, probably one of the latest we subscribe to in terms of commercial, industrial, and residential electricity prices, the same for natural gas. You can look at the legend, but typically, as I mentioned earlier, orange and reddish color represent higher values, therefore higher prices, and the bluish greenish represent a little bit sort of lower values and lower prices. I won't click on natural gas. It's a very similar type of information. Moving on to utilities, we also provide as a reference electric utility. You can click again on any location on the map, and it brings up that information for you. I must have clicked on several as it brings up a large radius. Whatever you put the pointer of the in any of the map is just going to bring you the information of what utility serves that particular territory. We provide that information for request from one of our users last year during our testing time. We also provide information on average cost of electricity. Again, you can go to the legend, see what the different values in terms of dollar per kilowatt hours. You can query the data and so forth. We also provide a lot of boundary information. The tribal lands is by default always turned on. You can turn it off if you would like to explore something else. We have information on counties, states, federal lands, again, very important for project development, and especially here in the West. And we also provide information on congressional districts as of the last redistricting. I mentioned the query that again you can point and click and so forth, but now I'm going to switch to something that is very much tailored to a particular tribal area, where the tool summarizes various data information that they're pertinent to that particular location. It also pulls a lot of information from all the data sets that I just showed you into one nice snapshot. So you can search for a given area from the list, which is alphabetical, or you can just type in whichever location you're looking for. And the tool pops up a map of that location. It also brings up information from the Census Bureau in terms of some demographic and socioeconomic data, population, total housing units, occupied housing units, and units with electricity. It also brings information on currently installed capacity for renewable energy resources. And here's a list of what's currently installed on site. And then the tool generates information on the utility scale renewable energy potential in terms of capacity and generation in megawatt and megawatt hour, respectively, by technology. Here I would like to point out, as in the previous, earlier when I showed you the resource potential, the tool currently generates estimates only for utility scale. So when you see 0 for some location, that doesn't mean that there is no potential. It is just, again, the estimates are utility scale, but it is very likely that there is certainly potential on distributed generation side. So I would like to stress that, emphasize that, so folks don't wonder and think that there is no potential at a given area that they've zoomed in and clicked in. There's certainly, again, opportunities for DG. It's just because without us knowing the site, the load, just some site-specific information is difficult for us to do a distributed generation type of analysis. We also provide in the bottom more information, again, from where most of this data came from, except demographic and socioeconomic. But we also provide an email here. We encourage you, please, if some of the data here in the socioeconomic and demographic or the installed capacity is incorrect, please get back to us. We're happy to hear from you and update the database. This is to the best of our knowledge. In the case of the demographic and socioeconomic, it's to the best of what's publicly available from, again, the U.S. Census Bureau. We did already hear from some tribes that wanted us to update some of those numbers, so we certainly update those, and you will see for some that here it says 2017 or 2018, depending on when we've heard from them. So again, happy to update that. We're just working with the information that we have at hand. Since I have this location, I will just move on quickly to show you an example of what kind of analysis, in addition to the tribal land query, you can do yourself. Again, you can click on and off different layers. You can bring them all together for whatever purposes you need. And since I work in biomass, I'm a little biased. I will show you a bioenergy type of analysis. For example, I will bring in here the biomass resource potential. I would like to see that's a pretty good location. Let me see what else. I would like to bring naturally the transmission lines, and I will change the order so we can see it better in a second. I would like to bring railroads as well because biomass, unlike wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, is transportable, and railroad provides naturally the least expensive type of transportation. So we always look for railroads in that particular technology. Now I changed the site so we can see a little better how there's some intersection with good resources. Here we have intersection with railroad that could be transported, and as well as location intersection with transmission lines. I would also like to see actually if I have some competitors here, because again, biomass, unlike wind and solar, it is exhaustible in given location, so supply really matters, as well as, again, the feedstock cost and so forth. So I'm not sure if there would be any, let's see. I don't think there's any coal-firing power plants here. Landfill is not applicable. Pellet plants, because they're using woody biomass, and we're displaying predominantly woody biomass here. So I see one right here in the bottom. I'm going to zoom in here. There is one pellet plant. So between these two tribal lands, we certainly see some competitor. And I will turn also on wood and woody waste. Oh, I see. So between these three, there's quite a few actually between those three. You can use the query function and see what is the capacity of these particular locations. So I see that they do definitely use the wood and woody biomass. Total capacity is 22 megawatts. So if you know the potential here that we estimate in terms of how much the potential and subtract what is currently used, you can do some, again, simple calculations of where you are in terms of resource availability, what is actually currently used, and again, by these locations already, and how much you might have available for another project. So again, this is a very quick sort of a demo of how you can use the tool. Again, feel free to play with it, use it to the best of your knowledge, and again, we welcome any feedback you can give us in terms of what other information you would like to see, what other functionality, and so forth. Just a note that we do hope in the future to add incentives and policies that are applicable to tribes specifically. So it would be a similar feature to the light tribal land query where folks would click, and for that given location, the tool will sort of bring up that information on incentives, credits, and other tax breaks that are applicable to tribe. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anelia. I'll take control back, but if we have any questions later related specifically to the tool, we'll transfer control back to you. All right, so with that, those are all of our presentations today. We'll go on to question and answers, but first, just an informational slide here. I want to highlight that we do have the link to the Tribal Atlas tool that we just that Anelia just demoed, and the link here to all the slides, which will be available in about 1 week. So with that, let's answer or go to our question and answer portion of the webinar. We did have a few questions come in. Let me bring them up. But with that in mind, you know, please continue to submit questions now if you have any. So the first question I have here looks like it's for Lucas. Do you have any recommendations for navigating community solar in states in which investor-owned utilities have monopoly control over the energy market?
Yeah, so depending on your state, even though that the investor-owned utility might have a monopoly, there may be some policy that encourages that investor-owned utility to do community solar. So kind of going back further into my slide, I think there's like the Coalition of Community Solar. That organization has a pretty good idea of what's going on statewide as far as policy, and the Department of Energy tribal program may also have that knowledge as well. That would be my best recommendation.
Thanks, Lucas. Another question for you. For community solar, is it, or excuse me, with Bonneville Environmental Foundation for community solar, is it a one-for-one credit? Are there additional charges applied by the utility for reserves, etc.?
So I think I'm taking that to mean two different things. I might be misunderstanding it, but the first thing is that as far as Bonneville Environmental Foundation is concerned, our work to develop these types of projects is funded by Bonneville Power Administration. So it's at no cost to tribes that are with consumer-owned utilities. That's kind of the territory we can support. Now, as far as I think what the question might have been getting at, there tends to be some sort of administration fees within community solar programs, whether that's a traditional program through a utility or whether that's a third-party administrator where they're having some other creative way to fund, investors or subscribers. But with community solar, there tends to be some sort of administration fee to cover the cost of getting the background information to facilitate the project, and also just cover the cost it takes to get the project built and paid off. So it kind of depends. Within Oregon, we're in the process of getting our community solar program up and operational, and at least our understanding from the low to moderate income perspectives is that we want to see always positive credits on the bills. But if you're a high income subscriber, there is some potential that you might have higher administration costs than what you're seeing in benefits on certain months, specifically Pacific Northwest in the winter when there's low production. Not sure if that got at what the question was.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lucas. I think you covered it.
Okay, good.
Another question here for Anthony. How do you identify projects for potential development?
I think you have to look at a few factors, but identifying, I think looking at the resource is probably the first thing that you have to do. So in kind of going through that process or project implementation slides, that's the first thing you want to look at is the resource there? And with ours, essentially the wind turbine, we have strong winds we're off of Lake Erie. So we have a really good wind regime in that area. So we put our wind turbine there. Our solar was located somewhere where we have a higher, solar capacity. So I think the first thing you need to do is that. Then you go down the line looking at your financing options and how to best structure the deal. But the resource being there is the ultimate need.
Great, thank you. And then also, Anthony, can you briefly touch on future goals for Seneca Energy?
Definitely. We are continuing, so there's a few. On our natural gas side, we are looking to actually expand some distribution pipeline. We do have our own natural gas utility where we have about 50 customers. We are looking to expand about 10 miles potentially, where we could add a few hundred customers that are currently on propane, and they would be coming to the cheaper fossil fuel natural gas, saving about half of the cost. And we're also looking at more renewable projects. So, ultimately we go back to that mission statement, trying to ensure the security and prosperity of the nation. We believe that energy is a huge part of that, as far as sovereignty goes and self-reliance. So the more we can do to move us in that direction, the more we're going to go after. And we're looking at some microgrids as well, where potentially we would even take some of our load off of the utility completely, and we'd be utilizing our renewable resources and really providing our own electricity to our buildings directly.
Great, thank you. Another question came in for Lucas. Excuse me. It says our local utility is only going to pay 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour for a 250 kilowatt community solar array on our reservation. They are claiming that that is all they are required to pay under PURPA. Is this rate too low to justify the investment? Or excuse me, this rate is too low to justify the investment. Any suggestions as to how to get around this?
Yeah, I think that is an issue, a similar issue we have in the Pacific Northwest as well. If one suggestion would be to scale down, I'm not sure if going lower would mean a higher rate. Well, you do lose the economic scale benefit. You could do a community solar project that's 50 kilowatts, or a bunch of smaller 50 kilowatt solar projects located by the communities you're hoping to serve. Also, it's hard to make it a long-term solution, but grants and loans are usually a good solution for that. When we have really low utility rates here, it's usually finding the appropriate grants to facilitate the development.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Lucas. I don't see any additional questions at this time, so we'll just pause a second and see if any other questions come in. And if anyone has interest in having Anelia, show any specific data set and their reservation or whatever, we can certainly accommodate that as well. So think about that. In the meantime, I'll continue monitoring for questions, but I'll just go on to the next slide, just to finish out the topics for the webinar here. So these are our upcoming webinars for the remainder of the 2018 series. In October, we have a webinar on distributed energy technology, trends and costs. So that's kind of a broad webinar discussing the evolution of the costs of distributed energy technologies and how they're being applied. And then our final webinar in November is on examples of tribes using microgrids to serve various purposes and on their reservation from a variety of standpoints, but basically use of microgrids and evolving uses for them in the context of tribal reservations. So with that, I still see no additional questions, so I will end the webinar at this time. We appreciated everyone's participation, and thank you for your attendance. We look forward to you joining us on future webinars, and thanks to all of our speakers for their valuable contributions today. Thanks for everyone's time, and have a good day.
Thanks, James.